My mother called me screaming that a village girl stole my father's heart. She has no idea. I'm the one who paid the bride price to finally set him free. Hello, welcome. You didn't find this by accident. These are stories of quiet courage, hidden truths, and people who chose heart over fear. If that pulls you in, please subscribe, tap the notification bell, and stay with us. Thank you. The vibration of the smartphone against the marble nightstand sounded like a low-altitude drone, a mechanical intrusion that shattered the curated peace of Ifeoma's Ikoyi penthouse. Outside, the Lagos skyline was a jagged necklace of lights, flickering with the nervous energy of 10 million souls. But inside, the air smelled of expensive sandalwood and the faint, metallic tang of an overworked air conditioner. It was 2:42 a.m. In Ifeoma's world, a call at this hour never brought news of birth or celebration. It was the herald of a crisis, usually draped in the high-pitched, operatic vibrato of her mother's voice. As she reached for the phone, the blue light washed over her face, highlighting the exhaustion etched into the corners of her eyes, a fatigue that had nothing to do with her design firm and everything to do with the heavy, invisible mantle of being the responsible firstborn daughter. She didn't need to see the caller ID to know it was Ezen. She knew the rhythm of her mother's panic, a calculated crescendo designed to bypass boundaries and demand immediate, unconditional sympathy. With a thumb that hesitated for only a fraction of a second, Ifeoma swiped the screen, and the silence of the room was instantly replaced by the jagged, wet sounds of a woman who had practiced her sorrow until it was a weapon of precision. Ifeoma, they have killed me. Your father has finally finished what he started 30 years ago. The voice was a jagged shard of glass, cutting through the stillness. There was no hello, no how are you, only the immediate, suffocating immersion into Ezen's latest tragedy. Her mother spoke in the language of a martyr, her words punctuated by the rhythmic slapping of palms against thighs, the traditional Igbo sign of extreme grief, though Ifeoma knew her mother was likely sitting on her velvet-upholstered throne in the Enugu mansion. He is marrying her, Ifeoma, a small girl, a girl the age of your younger sister, Chinelo. He wants to bring shame to my head in my old age. He wants to throw away my years of labor, my years of keeping his house, my years of bearing his children in the heat and the cold. He has found a new sweetheart to waste his money on, while I am here, dying of a broken heart. You must come home immediately. You must talk to that man before he drags the name of our family into the gutters of the village. Do you hear me? Or have you also joined him in this madness? Ifeoma closed her eyes, listening to the familiar cadence of the guilt trip, the way her mother effortlessly rewrote history to cast herself as the sole architect of the family's success. But beneath the facade of the dutiful daughter, Ifeoma felt a cold, sharp spark of triumph. It was done. The money had cleared, the arrangements were finalized, and the man she loved most in the world was finally escaping the prison Ifeoma had just helped him burn down. Growing up in the sprawling, white-pillared estate in Enugu, Ifeoma had learned early that home was a misnomer. It was a theater, and her father, Chief Okizi, was the perpetually exhausted stagehand. While the rest of the town saw a titan of the construction industry, a man whose word was bond and whose pockets were deep enough to pave the village roads, Ifeoma saw the way his shoulders slumped the moment his Mercedes cleared the security gates. The house was a museum of Ezen's expensive tastes, filled with gold-leafed mirrors that reflected her vanity and heavy drapes that muffled the sound of her father's sighs. Her mother's love was a transactional thing, a ledger where every meal served was a debt to be repaid in jewelry, and every day of enduring a husband's presence was a reason for a fresh grievance. Ifeoma remembered the quiet Sunday afternoons where her father would sit on the veranda, staring at the hibiscus bushes with a vacant, haunted look, only to be snapped back into a state of alert by the sharp, metallic click of her mother's heels. "Okizi, are you deaf? I said the generator is making a noise. Do you want us to live like bush people?" Ezen's voice never held a note of affection. It was a constant, low-frequency sandpaper, wearing down the granite of her father's soul until there was nothing left but dust and a terrifying, hollow silence. In the psychology of their household, there was no room for her father's humanity. He was a bank, a driver, a prestigious name to be used at the August meeting, and a convenient scapegoat for every one of Ezen's unfulfilled whims. Ifeoma, crouching behind the banister as a child, had watched her mother systematically strip him of his dignity, mocking his slow speech in front of his peers and accusing him of infidelity whenever he stayed late at a site just to avoid the venom waiting for him at home. There were no bruises on Chief Okizi's skin, but his spirit was a map of scars. He had suffered for Ezen's hand with a patience that bordered on the masochistic, believing that if he just provided enough, more lace, more cars, more prestige, the woman he had once loved would finally grant him a moment of genuine warmth. But Ezen was a well that could never be filled, a woman who mistook her husband's kindness for weakness and his silence for permission to escalate her cruelty. It was in those long, suffocating years of observation that Ifeoma realized a terrible truth. Her mother was not a victim of a patriarchal society, but a tyrant of a private one. And Ifeoma, watching her father wither like a plant deprived of sun, had begun to cultivate a secret, simmering resolve that one day she would be the one to pay the ransom for his soul. The construction sites of Chief Okizi's empire were not merely places of business. They were the physical manifestations of a man's attempt to outrun his own unhappiness. Under the blistering sun of the Nigerian interior, where the air shimmered with the heat of 1,000 ovens, Ifeoma's father moved through the skeletons of rising skyscrapers with a frantic, desperate energy. He was a man who understood the language of reinforced concrete and the steadfastness of granite, perhaps because they were the only things in his life that didn't demand more than he could give. Every brick laid was a silent prayer for a peace he couldn't find at home, a testament to a work ethic that had lifted him from the red dust of a village school to the mahogany-paneled boardrooms of the capital. He wore his successes like a heavy, gilded chain, a weight of gold that bought him the respect of the world, but couldn't buy him a single night of quiet in his own bedroom. Ifeoma remembered him coming home with cement dust caught in the creases of his forehead, his hands calloused and smelling of iron, only to be met by a wife who looked at him not as a partner, but as a faulty vending machine that hadn't produced enough for the month's social calendar. The money was never just money. It was the blood and sweat of a man who was being slowly bled dry by a woman who viewed his labor as her birthright. Ezen's relationship with her husband's wealth was one of aggressive consumption, a performance of status that masked a profound, hollow insecurity. She didn't see the exhaustion in the slump of his shoulders when he handed her the keys to a new Range Rover. She only saw the prestige it would afford her at the next Mwada meeting. To her, the weight of gold was a tool for social dominance, a way to ensure that no woman in Enugu could claim a higher pile of Asoebi fabrics or a more glittering set of Italian jewelry. While Chief Okizi sought solace in the tangible reality of his buildings, Ezen sought it in the ephemeral validation of her peers, turning their home into a warehouse of unused luxury. She would spend hours detailing the sacrifices she made by staying with a man who worked so much, effectively weaponizing his provision against him. Ifeoma watched as her mother transformed her father's hard-earned success into a cage, where every kobo spent on him was scrutinized as a waste, while every million spent on her vanity was deserved. It was a parasitic equilibrium that Ifeoma realized, even as a teenager, would eventually lead to a total collapse of the man beneath the gold. The dinner that broke the last of Ifeoma's illusions occurred during the chief's 50th birthday, a night intended for celebration that instead became a masterclass in psychological warfare. The grand dining room was filled with the elite of Enugu society, the air thick with the scent of jollof rice, expensive cognac, and the forced laughter of people who knew each other's secrets but ignored them for the sake of decorum. Chief Okizi had stood up to give a speech, his voice trembling slightly with a rare vulnerability, as he thanked God for the strength to provide for his family. But before he could finish a sentence about the importance of legacy, Ezen had interrupted him with a laugh that sounded like a porcelain plate shattering on a tile floor. She didn't just disagree with him, she dismantled him. In front of his business partners, his rivals, and his children, she mocked his humble origins, joking about how she had to teach him how to use a fork and how his success was merely the result of her prayers and management. The cracks in the porcelain were no longer invisible. They were gaping maws of resentment that sucked the air out of the room, leaving her father standing there, a titan of industry reduced to a bumbling schoolboy by the woman who was supposed to be his greatest ally. Ifeoma sat at the far end of the table, her fingers white-knuckled against her silver cutlery, watching the light die out of her father's eyes. It wasn't the first time Ezen had used the public stage to assert her dominance, but it was the most surgical. Her mother possessed a terrifying ability to find the exact insecurity, the village boy lurking beneath the chief, and twist it until it screamed. For the rest of the evening, Ezen moved through the crowd like a queen, receiving compliments on the party she had planned with her husband's money, while Chief Okizi retreated to the shadows of the veranda, nursing a drink he didn't want just to avoid her gaze. That night, the porcelain of their family life didn't just crack. It disintegrated into dust. Ifeoma realized then that her mother didn't just dislike her father. She despised the very core of who he was, and she would never stop until he was entirely hollowed out. It was the moment Ifeoma stopped being a bystander and began to wonder what the price of a man's freedom truly was, and if she had the courage to pay it. When Chief Okizi finally visited Ifeoma in her Lagos penthouse 3 years later, he looked like a man who had spent a decade in a drought-stricken land. The humidity of the coast usually bothered him, but in the sanctuary of his daughter's home, he seemed to breathe for the first time in years. Ifeoma watched him from the kitchen as he sat in one of her minimalist linen armchairs, staring out at the Atlantic Ocean with a stillness that was both peaceful and profoundly tragic. There was no Ezen here to complain about the temperature of the tea or the modern lack of lace doilies. There were no demands for new jewelry or critiques of his posture. In the quiet of the Lagos sanctuary, the chief's true self began to emerge from the wreckage, a man who loved jazz music, who liked his yams roasted rather than pounded, and who possessed a dry, gentle wit that his wife had long ago silenced. Ifeoma realized that her father didn't need a mansion or a title. He needed a space where his presence wasn't considered an inconvenience or a financial transaction. He stayed for a week, and in that week, the plan to betray the mama began to take its first concrete shape in Ifeoma's mind. The transformation in her father during that week was the final catalyst Ifeoma needed to cross the moral Rubicon. She saw him laugh, a real, deep-bellied sound, when she told him a story about a difficult client, and she noticed how he no longer flinched when a phone rang, expecting a barrage of insults from his wife. However, the tragedy returned on the final evening when he began packing his leather suitcase, his movements slowing as the reality of returning to the Enugu prison set in. He looked at Ifeoma and said, in a voice so low it was almost a whisper, "Ifeoma, sometimes I wonder if there is any version of my life where I am not just a ghost in my own house." It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her, a confession of total defeat that broke her heart into 1,000 pieces. She realized then that her father would never leave Ezen on his own. His sense of duty and his fear of the shame Ezen would weaponize were too strong. If he was going to be saved, someone else had to build the bridge for him. If he was going to find a life worth living, his own daughter would have to be the one to fund his escape, even if it meant she would become the villain in her mother's twisted narrative. The scouting process for a new wife was not something Ifeoma took lightly. It was a mission of redemption that required the precision of an intelligence operation. She didn't want a trophy or a gold digger. She wanted a woman who could provide the emotional oxygen her father had been denied for 3 decades. She found Nneka through a series of quiet inquiries in her father's home village, a place Ezen rarely visited because she considered the people there beneath her. Nneka was a 40-year-old widow and a primary school teacher, a woman with a face like a calm morning and hands that were used to the labor of love rather than the grasping for status. When Ifeoma first met her under the shade of a mango tree at the village square, She didn't see a rival to her mother. She saw a cure. Neka spoke of her late husband with a tenderness that made Ifeoma's eyes sting, and she described her simple life with a contentment that Ezen, in all her luxury, could never comprehend. The introduction wasn't about a transaction. It was about finding a soul that could recognize the value of the man Chief Okizi actually was, rather than the bank account he represented. The first meeting between her father and Neka was orchestrated by Ifeoma under the guise of a community project meeting in the village. She watched from a distance as her father, initially stiff and guarded, began to soften in the presence of Neka's genuine interest. Neka didn't ask him about his latest contract or his political connections. She asked him about the trees he had planted as a boy and the stories his grandmother used to tell. For the first time in his life, Chief Okizi was being looked at with eyes that saw his spirit instead of his wallet. Ifeoma saw the way Neka listened, not waiting for her turn to complain, but truly listening, and she knew that this was the woman who could heal him. The betrayal was now no longer a theory. It was a necessity. Ifeoma spent the evening talking to Neka about the realities of her father's life, being brutally honest about the mountain of baggage he would bring and the storm that Ezen would inevitably unleash. Neka's response was simple. A man who has carried such a heavy load for so long deserves a place to lay his head. In that moment, the pact was sealed, and the betrayed mama became an inevitable casualty of a higher mercy. To be the silent architect of her father's second marriage, Ifeoma had to become a master of compartmentalization, living a double life that was as exhausting as it was exhilarating. In Lagos, she was the successful professional. In Enugu, she was the dutiful daughter. But in the secret spaces of encrypted emails and offshore bank accounts, she was a revolutionary. She began by redirecting her own business profits into a separate fund, ensuring that not a single kobo of her father's official wealth would be touched, thus depriving Ezen of the legal grounds to claim he was stealing from their joint estate. Every detail of the new life was meticulously planned. A small, beautiful bungalow in a quiet part of Owerri, far enough from Enugu to provide a buffer, but close enough to the village to feel like home. She vetted the domestic staff, chose the furniture that she knew her father would find comfortable, and even handled the legal paperwork to ensure Neka would be protected. It was a project of immense complexity, a structural design of a man's future that required her to be cold, calculating, and utterly focused. She was building a fortress of peace, and every brick was laid with the knowledge that she was burning her bridges with her mother forever. The hardest part of being the architect was the emotional labor of maintaining the mask in front of Ezen. Her mother would call, complaining about the chief's increasing distance and his stinginess with her latest request for a diamond set. And Ifeoma would have to listen with a neutral expression, offering the empty platitudes she had honed over the years. "Maybe he's just tired, Mummy," she would say, while her heart hammered against her ribs at the thought of the Owerri house being painted that very afternoon. She felt a strange, jagged guilt, not for helping her father, but for the ease with which she could lie to the woman who had given her life. But then she would remember the cracks in the porcelain dinner, and the sight of her father's haunted eyes, and the guilt would vanish, replaced by a crystalline resolve. She was not betraying her mother out of malice. She was betraying a tyrant to save a victim. As the silent architect, she understood that peace sometimes requires a demolition, and she was prepared to be the one to push the plunger. The day of the IME ego, the payment of the bride price, was a surreal exercise in clandestine tradition. In the Igbo culture, this was the moment a marriage became real, a binding contract between two families that signaled the transfer of responsibility and the beginning of a new lineage. Ifeoma could not be there in person, of course, for fear of being recognized, but she was the invisible hand that guided every kobo. She had arranged for a trusted uncle, the one man in the family who had always seen through Ezen's facade, to act as the intermediary. Through a series of wire transfers that she had disguised as consultancy fees for her design firm, she provided the funds for the traditional gifts, the crates of malt, the bags of rice, the tubers of yam, and the cold, hard cash that would officially welcome Nneka into her father's life. As she sat in her Lagos office, staring at the transfer successful notification on her screen, Ifeoma felt a profound sense of finality. The transaction was complete. Her father was now, in the eyes of his ancestors and his village, a man with a new wife. She had bought him a second chance, and the cost was a secret that would eventually tear her family apart. That night, Ifeoma didn't celebrate. She sat in the dark and wept. The weight of what she had done, the sheer audacity of a daughter paying for her father's second wife, felt like a physical pressure on her chest. She was breaking every rule of daughterly conduct, every social expectation of the firstborn. In the eyes of the world, she was the ultimate betrayer, the child who had turned against the woman who birthed her. She thought of Ezen, who was likely at that very moment complaining about a servant or planning a new social conquest, entirely unaware that her world had just shifted on its axis. The cruelty of the transaction was not lost on Ifeoma, but neither was its necessity. She imagined Nneka's family receiving the gifts, the joy in their small village home, and the look on her father's face when he realized he was finally being welcomed into a family that wanted him for him, not for what he could provide. The transaction was a bridge made of money, but it was anchored in a love that Ezen had never understood, the kind of love that is willing to be hated in order to do what is right. When Ezen finally sensed that something was wrong, though she couldn't yet name it, she did what she always did. She staged a performance of grief that was designed to pull Ifeoma back into her orbit. She traveled to Lagos without warning, appearing at Ifeoma's door with a suitcase of sorrow and a list of grievances that grew longer with every breath. She stayed for 2 weeks, turning the penthouse into a theater of misery. She would sit in the living room, draped in dark wrappers, refusing to eat while lamenting her father's coldness and secretive behavior. "He doesn't even look at me when I speak anymore. Ifeoma," she would wail, her voice echoing off the minimalist walls. "He's seen someone, I know it. Some village girl has used juju on him to turn his heart against his rightful wife. We must go to a prayer mountain. We must fight this spiritual battle together." Ezen's performance of grief was a masterpiece of manipulation, a call to arms that relied on the traditional trope of the innocent wife and the wayward husband. She expected Ifeoma to be her general in this war, never suspecting that her daughter was the one who had funded the enemy's camp. Watching her mother perform was an agonizing experience for Ifeoma. She saw the skill with which Ezen wove her narrative, the way she conveniently forgot 30 years of her own coldness to focus on her father's recent disobedience. It was a reminder of why the betrayal was necessary. Ezen was incapable of self-reflection. To her, every problem was someone else's fault, every silence was an attack, and every act of her husband's independence was a spiritual crisis that needed to be crushed. Ifeoma had to sit through hours of prayer and counseling, nodding while her mother cursed the woman who was destroying her home. It was a surreal, sickening dance. Ifeoma realized that her mother didn't actually want her father back. She wanted the control back. She wanted the bank account and the status back. The performance of grief was not about a broken heart. It was about a bruised ego. As she watched Ezen cry crocodile tears over a marriage she had spent decades dismantling, Ifeoma felt a cold, hard shell form around her own heart. The performance was failing to move her, and that was when she knew she was ready for the end. While Ezen was performing in Lagos, Nneka was quietly becoming the unseen rival, a woman who won the war not through confrontation, but through the simple, radical act of kindness. In the bungalow in Owerri, which was now a home rather than a house, Nneka was creating an environment that was the polar opposite of the Enugu mansion. There were no gold-leafed mirrors or velvet drapes. There was only sunlight, the smell of fresh herbs, and the sound of laughter. Nneka didn't try to compete with Ezen's status. She didn't care about the chief's title or his connections. She treated him like a man who was tired, offering him a basin of warm water for his feet after a long day and cooking the simple, traditional meals he had been told were too common for a man of his stature. The unseen rival was a force of nature precisely because she was so invisible to the world that Ezen inhabited. She was the peace that passes understanding, the quiet after the storm. And as Chief Okizi spent more and more time in Owerri, the shadow that had lived in his eyes for 30 years began to lift. The contrast between the two women was the central axis of the story's slow build. Ezen was a fire that consumed everything in its path to stay bright, while Nneka was a hearth that kept the room warm without demanding to be the center of attention. Ifeoma, who visited the Owerri home in secret, was struck by the silence, a good silence, unlike the suffocating one in Enugu. She saw her father sitting in the garden with Nneka, the two of them shelling egusi together, their conversation low and easy. There was no tension in his jaw, no fear in his eyes. He looked younger, lighter, as if the weight of the gold had been replaced by the lightness of genuine companionship. Nneka was the unseen rival, because Ezen didn't even know she existed yet, but she had already won the only thing that mattered, her father's heart. Ifeoma realized that her betrayal hadn't just given her father a new wife, it had given him back his humanity. And as she watched them together, she knew that no matter how much Ezen screamed when the truth came out, it would be worth it to see her father this whole again. In the close-knit social architecture of an Igbo village, secrets are like water in a cracked pot. They eventually find a way to seep into the earth. The rumors of Chief Okizi's new life began as whispers among the palm wine tapers and the market women, growing into a steady hum that vibrated through the ancestral home. People noticed the chief's car taking the turn toward Owerri more often than the road to Enugu. They saw the new bungalow and the quiet, respectable woman who lived there. The village, which had long tolerated Ezen's arrogance only because of her husband's generosity, began to revel in the shame she didn't yet know she was carrying. It was a slow-motion collision of reputations. The rumors weren't just about a second wife. They were about the fall of the queen who had looked down on everyone from her white-pillared balcony. Ifeoma, hearing the echoes of these rumors through her village contacts, knew the clock was ticking. The betrayal was about to move from the shadows of a daughter's heart into the harsh light of public scandal. The villagers' reaction was a complex mix of schadenfreude and traditional pragmatism. While some tut-tutted about the disruption of a long-standing marriage, most felt a quiet satisfaction that the arrogant one was finally being humbled. A man cannot eat bitterness for 30 years and not look for sweet fruit, one elder was overheard saying at the local meeting. The rumors were the first real cracks in the mama's armor, a social pressure that Ezen, for all her power, could not control. She began to hear the whispers herself, the sudden silences when she walked into a room, the pitying looks from the women she used to intimidate. She dismissed it at first as envy and small-mindedness, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The village rumors were the heralds of the storm, the sound of the world preparing to turn its back on a woman who had never bothered to be kind to it. Ifeoma watched from Lagos as the pressure built, knowing that once the dam broke, there would be no way to save her mother from the flood of her own making. Maintaining the daughter's mask became a full-time occupation for Ifeoma, a performance of loyalty that required every ounce of her creative intelligence. She was now the primary confidant for both sides of a war she had started. She would spend her mornings on the phone with Nneka, discussing the logistics of her father's health and the management of the Owerri household, only to spend her afternoons listening to Ezen's increasingly paranoid rants about the enemies in the village. The mask was perfect. She was the sympathetic ear, the neutral advisor, the only one who truly understood her mother's pain. It was a psychological tightrope walk that left her drained and hollow. She began to see her own face in the mirror as a stranger's, a collection of practiced expressions and calculated silences. She was the betrayer in the most intimate sense, using her mother's trust to protect the very thing her mother wanted to destroy. The daughter's mask was her only protection, but it was also her greatest burden, a constant reminder of the price of her father's peace. The irony of the mask was that it made her closer to her mother than she had ever been. Ezen, sensing the world slipping away, clung to Ifeoma with a desperate, suffocating grip. She shared her deepest fears, her regrets, and her plans for vengeance, believing that Ifeoma was her ultimate ally. "You are the only one I can trust, Ifeoma," she would say, her eyes red from crying. "Everyone else is a snake, but you are my blood." Hearing those words was like a physical blow to Ifeoma's stomach. The betrayal felt personal now, a jagged blade that cut both ways. She realized that by saving her father, she was effectively killing the only version of her mother she had ever known, the powerful, untouchable queen. The daughter's mask was no longer just a tool for deception. It was a shield against the realization that she was destroying a woman who, however flawed, was still her mother. But every time she felt her resolve waver, she would remember the way her father's hands used to shake when Ezen entered a room, and she would tighten the mask and keep dancing. As the reality of the public announcement drew closer, Chief Okizi began to experience the father's hesitation, a paralyzing wave of guilt and tradition that threatened to undo everything Ifeoma had built. He was a man of his generation, and the prospect of the shame Ezen would bring upon the family was a weight he wasn't sure he could carry. He called Ifeoma late one night from a wherry, his voice thin and trembling. "Ifeoma, maybe we should stop? Maybe I should just come back to Enugu and accept my lot. Your mother, she will make the world burn if she finds out. I don't want you to be caught in the fire. I don't want our name to be dragged through the mud." This was the crisis Ifeoma had feared, the victim's reluctance to be saved. Her father was so conditioned to his own suffering that the prospect of peace felt like a sin. The hesitation was the final hurdle, a psychological barrier that required Ifeoma to step out of the shadows and become the moral arbiter of her father's life. Ifeoma didn't coddle him. She spoke to him with a clarity that was almost brutal. "Papa, you have spent 30 years in that house. You have given her everything a woman could ask for, and in return, she has given you nothing but bitterness. If you go back now, you aren't keeping the peace. You are choosing to die in the dark. Do you want to be a ghost, or do you want to be a man?" It was a harsh, necessary intervention. She reminded him that this wasn't just about him. It was about the precedent he set for his children and his village. The father's hesitation was the last gasp of the old life, the fear of the unknown finally clashing with the agony of the known. By the end of the call, her father was silent for a long time, and then he said, "You are more like your mother than you know. Ifeoma, you have her strength, but you use it for mercy." It was the highest compliment and the most terrifying indictment he could have given her. The hesitation was over. The path was set. The moment of permission was the true climax of the story's emotional build, a quiet, rain-soaked afternoon in Lagos when Ifeoma and her father sat together, and she officially gave him his life back. They were sitting on the balcony of her penthouse, the sound of the rain against the glass providing a rhythmic, metallic backdrop to their conversation. Her father looked at her, his eyes clear for the first time in years, and asked, "Ifeoma, why are you doing this? You know she will never forgive you. You know you're losing a mother." Ifeoma looked at the man who had worked his fingers to the bone to give her the life she now lived, the man who had endured 1,000 cracks in the porcelain dinners for her sake. "I'm doing it because you deserve to be happy, Papa," she said, her voice steady, "and because I'm the only one who can afford to lose her." This was the permission, not just for him to marry another woman, but for him to stop being a martyr. It was the daughter releasing the father from his vow of suffering. The permission was also a moment of profound role reversal. In a traditional African setting, the father gives the daughter permission to marry, to leave, to live. But here, in the modern, shifting landscape of their lives, the daughter was the one granting the father his independence. She was the one providing the financial and emotional infrastructure for his escape. They sat in silence for a long time after that, the air between them thick with the weight of the secret they shared. It was a sacred, tragic moment. Ifeoma knew that by giving this permission, she was signing her own death warrant in her mother's heart. She was choosing the victim over the mama, and in the moral economy of their family, that was the ultimate sin. But as she watched her father take a deep, steady breath, she felt a sense of peace that no amount of motherly approval could ever provide. The permission was granted, and the betrayed mama was now a woman whose reign was officially over. The storm clouds finally gathered on a Tuesday morning in Enugu, when Ezen, fueled by a tip from a well-meaning friend, drove to the village without warning. She didn't find her husband there, but she found the evidence of his absence, the reports from the villagers, the site of the Owerri Road, and finally, a misplaced receipt for a traditional marriage gift that her husband had carelessly left in his village office. The realization hit her like a physical blow, not of grief, but of total, incandescent rage. The storm wasn't one of tears, it was one of fire. She didn't call her husband, she called Ifeoma. The voice on the other end of the line was no longer the performing widow. It was a woman who had discovered treason. "I know. Ifeoma," she said, her voice a low, vibrating hiss. "I know everything. He has married a village rat, and he thinks he can hide her from me. He thinks he can throw me away like a used rag. But he has forgotten who I am, and I want you to find out who helped him. I want you to use your people in Lagos and your banks to find out where the money came from. Because when I find the person who funded this, I will skin them alive." The storm clouds were now overhead, and Ifeoma felt the first cold drops of the coming deluge. She sat in her office, her heart racing, listening to her mother describe the vengeance she was planning. Ezen was going to the police, she was going to the traditional rulers, she was going to the newspapers. She was going to make Chief Okeezi's name synonymous with adultery and shame. Ifeoma had to stay calm, her daughter's mask, now a frozen, terrifying necessity. "Mommy, please calm down. Let me come home. We will figure this out," she said, her voice a model of concerned innocence. But as she hung up the phone, she knew the time for figuring it out was over. The storm was here, and the next few days would determine who survived and who was swept away. She began to pack her bags, not for a rescue mission, but for the final confrontation. The betrayed mama was on the warpath, and Ifeoma was the only one who could stop her by finally stepping into the light and admitting she was the one who had provided the matches for the fire. The wedding day was not a grand affair. It was a quiet, almost holy ceremony in Nneka's village, a world away from the toxic luxury of the Enugu mansion. It was the official Igbankwu, the wine-carrying ceremony, and for the first time, Chief Okeezi stood before his community not as a benefactor, but as a groom. Ifeoma watched from the back of the small, shaded clearing, her heart in her throat. She saw her father take the cup of palm wine from Nneka, saw the way he looked at her with a reverence that was almost painful to witness. This was the fruit of her betrayal, a man being restored to his dignity in the presence of people who genuinely loved him. There were no storm clouds here, only the soft sound of the ojin and the rhythmic chanting of the village women. It was a scene of such simple, profound beauty that for a moment, Ifeoma forgot the war waiting for her in Enugu. She saw what her money had bought, not just a wife, but a community of peace. The ceremony was the ultimate subversion of Ezen's world. While her mother was in Enugu, screaming at servants and planning vengeance, her father was in a dusty village square, drinking wine with a school teacher and being welcomed as a brother. The contrast was the story's moral core. Ifeoma realized that betrayal is a matter of perspective. To Ezen, this was a crime, but to her father, it was a resurrection. As she watched them dance, a slow, dignified movement that had none of the performance of her parents' social life, Ifeoma felt a sense of closure. Whatever happened next, this day could not be taken away. Her father had found his sanctuary, and Nneka had found a man who would finally be appreciated for his spirit. The wedding day was the high-water mark of the story's slow build, the moment where the new life became an unshakable reality. But as the sun began to set over the village, Ifeoma saw the lights of her car waiting to take her to Enugu, where the mama was waiting, and she knew the reckoning had finally arrived. The confrontation took place in the grand foyer of the Enugu mansion, under the very gold-leafed mirrors that had watched 30 years of her father's decline. Ezen was waiting for her, not in wrappers of grief, but in her most expensive lace, her face a mask of cold, hard fury. On the mahogany table between them lay a stack of papers, bank statements that Ifeoma had thought were well hidden, but which her mother's scouts had finally unearthed. "I found it, Ifeoma," Ezin said, her voice like a whip. "I found the trail. The consultancy fees. The community projects. I thought it was a stranger. I thought it was some village enemy. But it was you, my own daughter, the one I carried for 9 months. You paid for that woman. You bought your father a whore with my own legacy." The silence that followed was the heaviest thing Ifeoma had ever experienced. The daughter's mask finally fell, shattering on the marble floor, and for the first time in her life, Ifeoma looked at her mother with eyes that held no fear, only a deep, exhausted pity. "It wasn't your legacy, Mummy," Ifeoma said, her voice surprisingly calm. "It was his life, and you were killing him." The confrontation was not a screaming match. It was a cold, surgical dissection of 30 years of abuse. Ezin tried to strike her, her hand raised in a traditional gesture of maternal curse. But Ifeoma caught her wrist, the strength of the daughter finally eclipsing the power of the mother. "You can curse me all you want, but you will never again use your grief to destroy that man. I paid for his marriage because it was the only way to pay for his freedom. You had 30 years to love him, and you chose to use him instead. So yes, I betrayed you. I betrayed the mama to save the man you never bothered to see." Ezin collapsed into a chair, the storm clouds finally breaking into a rain of genuine, ugly tears, not for her husband, but for the loss of her control. The confrontation was the end of the world as they knew it, a total collapse of the family hierarchy that left both women standing in the ruins of their shared history. In the aftermath of the confrontation, the judgment of kin was summoned, a meeting of the extended family to address the sacrilege of a daughter funding her father's second marriage. The elders sat in a circle in the Enugu garden, their faces grave, their canes tapping against the stone in a rhythmic, judgmental pulse. Ezin sat among them, a fallen queen seeking restoration, her voice a low, constant murmur of betrayal and shame. Ifeoma stood in the center, a modern woman in a traditional court, facing the men who held the moral authority of her lineage. They asked her to explain herself, to justify the unheard-of act of turning against her mother. The judgment was not just about the marriage. It was about the subversion of the entire African family structure. How could a daughter do this? How could she choose a father over the woman who gave her life? Ifeoma didn't offer excuses. She offered evidence. She spoke of the shadow in the house, the cracks in the porcelain, and the 30 years of the weight of gold. She described the man who had visited her in Lagos, a man who was a ghost in his own house. She spoke with a cinematic vividness that forced the elders to see the reality behind Ezin's facade. "Is it a sin to save a man from a slow death?" she asked, her voice echoing through the garden. "Is it a betrayal to give back to a father what his wife has stolen?" The judgment of kin was a long, agonizing process, but as Ifeoma spoke, she saw the shift in the elders' eyes. They knew the truth. They had always known it, but they had ignored it for the sake of tradition. Ifeoma's betrayal was the truth they could no longer ignore. By the end of the meeting, there was no curse, no banishment. There was only a heavy, uncomfortable silence, and the realization that the old rules had been broken by a love that was stronger than tradition. The revelation was Ifeoma's final monologue, the moment where she laid bare the psychological architecture of her mother's toxicity to the one person who still believed Ezin was a victim, her younger sister, Chinelo. They were sitting in the car, leaving the Enugu mansion for the last time, the gates closing behind them with a final metallic clang. "You think I'm a monster, Chinelo," Ifeoma said, her voice soft but unbreakable. "You think I've destroyed our mother. But look at the house we just left. It's filled with gold and lace, and it's the coldest place on earth. Mummy didn't lose a husband. She lost a servant. She didn't lose a love. She lost a bank account. I didn't betray her. I just stopped being her accomplice." The revelation was the final piece of the puzzle, the moment where the betrayed mama was seen not as a victim of a husband's infidelity, but as the architect of her own isolation. Ifeoma explained the transaction, the sanctuary, and the unseen rival, showing her sister that their father's new life was not an attack on their family, but a preservation of what was left of it. She spoke of the peace in Owerri, the way their father's hands no longer shook, and the way Nneka looked at him with genuine eyes. The revelation was the bridge that brought her sister to her side, a shared understanding of the terrible cost of their upbringing. They realized that they had been raised in a theater of cruelty, and that Ifeoma had been the only one brave enough to walk off the stage. As they drove toward Lagos, the revelation felt like a cleansing fire, burning away the last of the daughter's mask, and leaving behind something real, something honest. They were no longer the daughters of the betrayed mama. They were the daughters of a man who had finally found his way home. The new morning found Ifeoma back in her Lagos penthouse. But the air no longer felt like an overworked air conditioner. It felt like a fresh ocean breeze. She stood on the balcony, watching the sun rise over the Atlantic, a pale gold light that washed over the city. She had lost her mother. The silence from Enugu was absolute, a cold, dead void that she knew would never be filled, but she had found her father. She had received a photo from Owerri that morning. Her father and Nneka sitting on their new porch, drinking tea, a simple, grainy image of two people who were content. There was no weight of gold in the photo, only the lightness of a man who was no longer a ghost. The story had reached its end, not with a grand reconciliation, but with a quiet, necessary peace. The new morning was also a beginning for Ifeoma. She realized that by saving her father, she had also saved herself. She was no longer the responsible firstborn daughter carrying the weight of her mother's expectations. She was a woman who had defined her own morality. She had chosen mercy over tradition, and although the price was the betrayed mama, she knew she would pay it again 1,000 times. The story of Ifeoma and Chief Okizi was a cinematic testament to the complexity of love and the heavy cost of freedom in a modern African world. As she turned back into her apartment to start her day, she felt a profound, quiet strength. The shadow in the house was gone, and in its place was a new, bright morning. The betrayal was complete, the freedom was won, and for the first time in 30 years, the ghost was finally alive. Was this a daughter's mercy or the ultimate betrayal? Drop a comment if you'd burn that bridge to save your father, and hit follow to see what happens when the mama finds the bank statements.